the work that I do with new Americans or individuals who have experienced refugee resettlement, it seems like every election cycle, I will have a new set of questions that often include this: are those people here legally? Now, I appreciate the question, but that question is incomplete. And so I'd love to unpack that so that there's just some more full picture information going around the web these days. First, we got to unpack the word legal. Now, when I hear that word legal, what's implied in that is really another word after that: legal immigrant. And here in the US, there are four legal means of immigration. The first is family-based immigration, where US citizens can apply and request to have family members come to the United States. For example, a father has come and found legal status here in the United States and then applies to have his wife and children come along with him. The second is employment-based immigration. These are individuals who have received a job offer from a US company or exhibit extraordinary abilities that can otherwise not be found in an American pool of laborers. The third is refugee and asylum status. These are the displaced people in the world. The over 100 million people that are displaced today are, in and of themselves, not yet a legal status. Displaced is a reality. Refugee and asylee are a legal term. So let's unpack those two. Both a refugee and an asylee have a shared experience of a threat to their life or fear of persecution due to their religious background, ethnic background, political ideologies, or some other contributing factor. A refugee is a displaced person when they have crossed an international border and is recognized by the United Nations. The majority of displaced people who have been legally identified as a refugee live in neighboring countries to the country of their origin and are living in refugee camps, many of whom live an average of 17 years in a refugee camp. Families who are refugees can apply and request to be resettled to a receiving country, which includes many Western countries, but also, again, neighboring countries who can house and allow those families to resettle. The average vetting process for a family to be resettled to a country like the United States is 2 years. Upon arrival in a country like the United States, and in the case for America, those families have local resettlement agencies and services that have been funded historically by the government to allow for basic needs to be met and to have some form of self-sufficiency within 90 days. Thereafter, the weight and responsibility of caring for these new neighbors is held by the web of local relationships made up of religious organizations, local institutions, for-profits, nonprofits, and other social impact leaders and groups that want to see our communities thrive. An asylee is like a refugee who's gone through all of those same experiences, except they've never yet begun the process of seeking resettlement in another country. In turn, they find themselves already within a country that they could see themselves remaining in, and they seek asylee status and then have a retroactively applied vetting process, after which they either remain or are asked to return to their country of origin. Many Afghans who were living in Afghanistan at the time that the US fully pulled out of the country sought asylee status. They were brought to the US, housed at local military bases, and there sought asylee status before they could engage with and integrate into local American communities. Fourth legal pathway for immigration to the US is what's called a diversity visa lottery. This is where each year the US government randomly selects a select amount of individuals to receive an offer to come to the United States into a pathway toward citizenship. Under this fourth pathway, I myself am a US citizen. In other words, I'm an immigrant. All of my great grandparents immigrated to the US in the late 1800s and early 1900s from Poland, Sweden, Italy, and France. All of them were allowed into the US because their country of origin had a low rate of immigration. Here's what I mean by that. At the time in the early 1900s, the US government set a cap of the amount of people that could immigrate to the US from set countries. Within that cap, my family members were able to arrive in the US legally. So what happens when that cap has been met? Well, If that cap has been met and you've not been given employment status through a US company, you do not show extraordinary abilities that the US population cannot already provide, you don't already have family members here legally, and you do not have a threat to your life, then there is no legal means for you to come to the US. To make this more complicated, if you come to the US under an offer of one of these four means of immigration and any of those are rescinded, you then find yourself here illegally. For example, I know of one individual who was offered a job at a US company upon completing their undergraduate. Unbeknownst to this individual, the company was bought out and that job position was absorbed. But the individual is never notified of this change, and upon expiration of their student visa, found themselves without a job and without any legal means to remain in the US. Another example is a family who had a threat against their life over their religious background and had the ability to come to the US under a visa. During the course of this 2-year visa, they then applied for asylee status to seek a retroactive legal means to stay in the US. They attempted to be proactive, beginning this process over a year before their existing visa was going to expire, providing all the necessary paperwork and talking to the necessary individuals to begin that process. You know what their response was from the government? Your visa is not yet expired, and we have some other pressing paperwork to complete. And so we will wait until your current visa expires, and then we will give you temporary protective status while we then await your legal permanent status. In other words, the government actually has systems in place to provide a in-between status for those who are caught between expired legal means while remaining on a pathway towards legal residence. For me, this is why I really find the term legal and illegal to not be helpful. What would be a better word that I would use in my experience of what we're getting at in this complex system of immigration that starts simple and then very quickly becomes more complex? It's the difference between being seen and unseen. The reality is that unless you are a First Nations people, every single one of us who call the United States home are themselves immigrants. The United States has always had a messy identification with who qualifies for immigration. In other words, who do we see and who do we choose to not see? Early on, it was a prejudice towards groups that we were not Anglo-Saxon, that were not Protestant. So there was a question about Irish and Italians. This is part of my family story. When my Italian family members immigrated to the US in the late 1800s, they did two things that illustrate why they were unseen. One, they changed their names. So my great grandfather's name was Giuseppe Susca, and he chose to change his name to Joseph Sisko, thereby changing the trajectory of our family's lineage to make themselves more seen. But there's another part of our family story that we uncovered back when I was in high school and visited Ellis Island and got to see some of the immigration paperwork that has been retained, and was able to track down our family's paperwork because they themselves had come through Ellis Island. And something that we discovered surprised us. One of my grandfather's sisters had some learning disabilities. And at the time, in the late 1800s and 1900s, if you were coming to the US, even under the lottery system of allotted visas, if there were any physical defects, you would be turned away. And rather than my family stating the truth, they lied. They marked no to any, at that time in their vocabulary, learning or physical ailments. In other words, they came in the US illegally. And they did that because at that time, the limitations to the ideal of what was physical and mental wellness was not seen. And in order to be seen, to become a US citizen, they shifted their image and appearance in order to make it to the US. And this tension of seen and unseen has continued through the last several centuries, from Catholic immigrants to Chinese immigrants to Southern and Eastern European immigrants to Japanese immigrants during World War II to now the current tension of Mexican and Latin American immigrants as well as Muslim immigrants. The tension remains of who do we see and who do we not see. I get it. And this, I just want to name it up front. This system is messy. It's so messy that both sides of the political aisle have wrestled through this need for immigration reform, and year to date has not happened. And so when I'm asked, are they here legally? The short answer is yes, they are by definition. But having now been in this work for 10 years, years, hearing stories, meeting individuals, seeing them as more than a lottery or status or statistic. The biggest question that I want to pose back to us now and every season is, who do you see? And the harder question that I don't think we can answer on our own is, who are we not seeing? The unseen, whose systems and policies do not consider their unique story. The unseen, who don't fit the archetype of what we think it means to be fully human. The unseen, who are US citizens and whose stories include no form of immigration, but just trafficking and exploitation. So again, I ask, who do you see and who do you not see?